Hi, this is Steve Sawtell with Slot Car Corner. Today I'm going to demonstrate a tuning tip, share a tuning tip with you here that many racers tend to take for granted. They probably never give it a second thought. It's one of those tips, it's a little thing in and of itself. It may not make a huge difference in your car's performance, but when combined with other little tips, it's one of those things that can definitely help improve the performance of your car. What I'll demonstrate today is installing some replacement bushings, some aftermarket bushings. I'll show you how to align those bushings so that the center axis of the bushings is concentric with the center axis, the long axis of the axle. And the whole idea here is to reduce friction in the drivetrain. And particularly with the 1/32 cars, the motors are relatively small. They don't have a lot of power or torque. So any friction that gets introduced into that rear drivetrain will have a detrimental effect. It'll tend to reduce the amount of RPMs that you have at the rear wheel. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to use a bushing alignment kit that's offered on my website, www.slotcarcorner.com. This particular kit has 3 components to it. The first component is a diamond-coated burr bit. This is actually designed to sharpen chainsaw blades. It's designed to be chucked into a Dremel or some sort of a moto type tool. For our purposes, however, I would strongly recommend that you do not use a Dremel. Instead, we're going to use this by hand, and I'll demonstrate that in just a bit. The second component is a pin gauge. At first, this may look like an axle, a 3/32 axle, but there's a couple of notable differences. First, it's a bit shorter. It's about 2 inches. Most 3/32 axles are roughly 2 1/4 inches long. Some a little shorter, some a little longer. And the other thing here is, and you won't be able to pick this up without a micrometer or something, but the outer diameter of the pin gauge is slightly larger than 3/32 of an inch. And specifically what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the outer diameter of this pin gauge as close as possible to the inner diameter of the bushings that we're going to install in the chassis. And what we're trying to do there is we're trying to eliminate any slop between the axle and the bushing to ensure that the bushings are as perfectly aligned or concentric or as near concentric as possible with the center axis, the long axis of the axle once we actually insert it. The third component that's included in this particular bushing alignment kit, these are bronze bushings. Several manufacturers offer these bushings. This particular bushing is one of the Slot Car Corner bushing. It's called a racing bushing. What makes it a little different from most other bushings, there are a couple of things. One is, first of all, the inner diameter, the inner bore of this particular bushing is a little bit smaller than other manufacturers' bushings. And what that does is there's less slop when you install this onto a standard 3/32 axle, and it just makes it a little bit easier to get better alignment with the bushings, and there's less slop in the drivetrain as the rear wheels and the rear axle rotate. The second major difference here, notable difference on these particular bushings, is that they're counterbored. So in addition to the 3/32 bore that goes through, for the axle, there's a second bore that's slightly larger that goes about halfway through the counter bore. And basically what that's designed to do is to reduce the total surface area on the inside of this bushing. Less surface area on the inside of the bushing is less surface area that's riding on your axle. Therefore, there's less friction. This is an old trick. This is not something new. This has been around for quite some time in many different classes and scales. So we take advantage of it here. One other byproduct of the counter bore is when you lubricate these bushings with your favorite lubricant. If you put just a little drop on the side of the bushing that's got the counter bore, that counter bore will serve or act as a sort of well. It'll tend to hold that lubricant in place, and over time it'll be wicked into the inside of the bushing, between the bushing and the axle, through capillary action. So it's a nice little side benefit. Right, so what we're going to do now is I'll go ahead and demonstrate how to use the kit to install these bushings and to align them. And keep in mind, in addition to having the near perfect alignment, this is something that's repeatable. You can do this each and every time. And again, this can be used on any plastic chassis that uses a 3/32, a nylon type bushing. And again, it's very easy to do. So we'll start with the bushing carriers on the plastic chassis. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use the diamond coated burr to enlarge the inside of that bushing carrier just very, very slightly. And there's a couple of reasons that we want to do this. If you've ever used one of these aftermarket bushings, whether it's a slot car corner bushing or somebody else's bushing, you may notice that it's a very, very tight fit, and on some of these chassis it will eventually cause a stress fracture where the bushing carrier will crack or possibly even break off. If that happens, at that point there's no practical way to repair the chassis. The chassis essentially is no longer useful, and you'll have to replace it. So by enlarging these bushing carriers here just a little bit, it prevents the bushings, once they're installed, from causing those cracks and those stress fractures. The second thing that it does is by enlarging this a bit, it provides a little bit more wiggle room for the bushings, so that once they're installed, it's a little bit easier for the bushings to align themselves once the pin gauge is inserted. The bushings, that extra wiggle room just lets them position themselves where they need to be positioned, to be properly aligned. Let's go ahead and we'll do this. So again, don't use a Dremel tool. Again, you'll just take off far too much material, and you'll probably render the chassis unusable. So just hold it between your thumb and your forefinger. You're just going to insert this into the bushing carrier area, and you're going to just use a slight twisting motion. And as you do that, you'll feel the diamond burrs there on the bit. You'll feel them making contact with the plastic and removing some of that plastic. I'm just twisting it very slowly, and at the same time I'm pushing toward the center of the chassis. Again, I'm just going back and forth, and eventually it just worked its way through. Again, we're just trying to take out a little bit of plastic, and you'll actually see a black ring of plastic. May not be visible on the camera, but on the bit where it's removed that. So we're not trying to take out large amounts of plastic, just enough for that burr bit so that it goes through and it spins freely. I'll turn the chassis around, and we'll repeat the same process on the other side for the other bushing carrier. Again, I'm going to twist it, just twist it and push it. And again, I'm not trying to force it through there. Twist it in, and then it finally goes through. Again, I can see some more plastic on the burr bit. Okay, and I'll remove the burr bit. So at this point, the bushing carriers have been enlarged slightly, and they're ready to go ahead and install the bushings. Now, when we install the bushings, again, if you're using a plain bushing, it doesn't really matter, which way you put it on the pin gauge. In this particular case, since I'm using these racing bushings that I offer on this particular chassis, I like to install them on the pin gauge with the counterboard side of the bushing facing toward the outside of the pin gauge, toward the ends of the pin gauge. And the reason I do this is once it's installed in this particular chassis, once we've got everything assembled and put back together again, I find that it's easier to lubricate the bushings without taking the car apart if the counterbore is pointing toward the outside of the chassis. Now, before I actually line this up and get ready to install it, there's one other thing that I'd like to point out, and that is normally what I would do here is I would go ahead and I would install the motor into the chassis. I would snap it in place, adjust it, and then I would secure it, with some hot glue or goop or whatever you use for that purpose. And the reason for that is when you do that, the holder for the motor is adjacent to the holders for those bushing carriers. In some cases, it'll expand or just bend that a little bit. So I want any of that flex or any of the twisting that's going to take place as a result of inserting the motor into the chassis. I want that to take place before I install my bushings. If I install the bushings first and then install the motor, it's possible that as a result of installing the motor, it might twist and the chassis, the bushing carriers, ever so slightly, and just cause some misalignment. For purposes of this video and for clarity, I have not installed the motor so that you can see hopefully more clearly the steps to install those bushings and align them in the carrier. Okay, but again, if you're doing this for real, go ahead and install your motor into the chassis and secure it in place with your favorite adhesive. Okay, so that said, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to space the bushings on the pin gauge. And you'll notice, by the way, if you slide these back and forth, the bushings on the pin gauge, they don't slide back and forth, nor does the pin gauge spin or rotate as freely within them as if you had an axle. And again, this is because the tolerances are much, much tighter between the pin gauge and the inside of that bushing. That's intentional. It will spin. It does spin freely, but again, it's not as free as if you had a 3/32 axle there. So we're going to align the bushings and the carriers over the bushing carriers, and I'll just see if I can bring that up. At this point, I haven't inserted them down into the bushing carriers. I've just positioned the bushings. I've spaced them out on that pin gauge so that they're directly over the bushing carriers, and I'm ready to insert the bushings down into the chassis. Now, this next step is very important. When you actually insert those bushings into the chassis, you need to be careful how you do that. What you don't want to do is you don't want to press down on the outside ends of this pin gauge, nor do you want to push down on the portion of the pin gauge that's between the bushings. If you do that, you're almost certain to bend that pin gauge. If you bend the pin gauge, then you're defeating the whole purpose of having this precision, nice straight pin gauge to align your bushings. If that pin gauge gets bent, then by definition your bushings are not going to be in perfect alignment. All right, so what we're going to do instead, I find is most effective, is we're going to push down from the top, directly on top of these bushings, using our thumbs, and we're going to seat those bushings into the bushing carriers in that fashion. So again, I'm not going to push down directly on the pin gauge. I'm going to press those into place firmly using my thumbs. Now I'm going to try not to block this. I'll do the best I can, but unfortunately it will get blocked somewhat. So again, I'm just putting some pressure on those bushings. I'm pressing straight down, and you'll generally hear them snap into the bushing carriers. All right. So at this point, the bushings have been installed into the bushing carriers on each side. They've been snapped in. Just double check, make sure that they're in the right position. So then the next thing that I want to do is I want to spin this pin gauge. All right, and in this particular case, again, you have to keep in mind it's not going to spin as freely as a 3/32 axle once you put the axle in there, because the tolerances are tighter. On the other hand, sometimes when you put these in, you won't be able to spin the pin gauge initially, or it'll be very, very difficult to take quite a bit of force, with your thumb and your forefinger to spin this. If that's the case, this is a somewhat iterative process in many cases. What you'll want to do is go ahead and press down again. Repeat that process of pressing down on top of those bushings. Test until you spin it. And generally what will happen is each time that you press down on those bushings, the alignment will improve, and it'll be easier and easier to turn the pin gauge inside the bushings. Once you've got it to the point, and again, it's a little bit of trial and error. The more you do this, you kind of get a feel for what's aligned and what's a reasonable amount of force to spin this. But this is spinning pretty freely at this point, so I really don't need to do any further alignment on this. It feels pretty good. So, I'm going to want to secure these bushings in place on the chassis. All right, I'm going to want to, while the pin gauge is holding them in alignment, I want to secure those bushings. Now, different racers use different adhesives to do this. This is largely a matter of personal preference. My preference is I like to use super glue. Now, some racers frown upon that, and I understand and I respect that. But in my case here, their concern is that if they ever have to remove these bushings from the chassis, that if you use super glue, potentially you're going to damage or break the chassis, which is true. But in my experience, once I glue a set of bushings into the chassis, I have no need or desire, to remove them. They're in there for good. So I find that super glue works quite well. It's very easy to do. So with the super glue, I'm not going to actually glue these in because I'd have to wait for them to dry. I've actually got another chassis that I'll use that I've glued up beforehand. But basically, what we would do here is you would, and if we're going to use super glue, we would take our super glue. We would put a small drop of super glue on the top rounded portion of the bushings between the two flanges. We just put a drop on top of each bushing, and again, we want to be careful that you don't put too big a drop there, or it'll flow over the sides of the bushing and it'll get down onto the pin gauge or possibly into inside of the bushing, and we don't want that to happen. So just a small drop, a super glue on top of each one of those bushings. Make sure you keep it between the flanges. And what will happen is the capillary action will go ahead and pull some of that super glue down between the bushing and the bushing carrier. And very, very important, once you've done that, set the chassis aside and make sure that the super glue is completely dry before we go on to the next step. Very, very important. Okay, so once we've glued that in place, just make believe that I did glue this. Then the next step, we've let the glue dry very thoroughly. Then what we need to do is we need to remove the pin gauge. Now you need to be very careful here because you can undo all this work and attention to detail up to this point. You can undo all of that if you're not careful removing the pin gauge. So when you remove the pin gauge, again, use your thumb and your forefinger to grasp it as close to one of these bushings as you can. And what I find works the best is to go ahead and to just turn it in one direction, and as I'm turning it, I'm slowly, and I stress slowly, removing it. It's not a race. I'm not trying to see how fast I can pull that pin gauge out of the bushings and stuff like that. I'm going very slowly and very deliberately. And keep in mind that the further you remove the pin gauge from those bushings, the more leverage that you have on that pin gauge, so it becomes easier to inadvertently twist one of those bushings. Even though it's glued in place, you can potentially cause the bushings to become misaligned. So take your time. Again, keep your fingers up very close to the bushing. Just twist it nice and easy, and eventually it'll work its way out. So just twist it. And again, I'm keeping my thumb and my forefinger as close to that bushing as I possibly can. Okay, I'm working the pin gauge out slowly, slowly, slowly. Okay, and eventually the pin gauge is removed. Now at that point, your bushings should be in perfect alignment, or they should be in very, very, very good alignment. And again, it's repeatable. You can do this over and over and over again on any of the chassis that you employ this procedure. So I've got another chassis here that I've followed the exact same procedure that I've described up to this point. In this particular chassis, I've actually glued up or used some super glue to glue these bushings into the chassis. I've set it aside. The super glue has dried very thoroughly. Now again, if I wanted, if I wasn't careful, with the pin gauge removing it, or when I put the axle in, I could potentially, cause those bushings to come back out of alignment. So we just need to exercise some care here. So you may be wondering, how do you know, if the bushings are aligned, or is there anything that you can do to check? And what you'll find is, once you've done this, a couple of times, you can just drop your rear axle right down through the bushings. And at that point, if you're a doubting Thomas, then you can try that with your nylon bushings before you started this procedure, or you can just snap a pair of bushings in without going through the alignment process. And it's possible that if the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets are in perfect alignment, your axle might drop through there, but more often than not, it'll possibly go partway through one of the bushings, but it won't go all the way down through the second bushing. So by having these bushings in perfect alignment like this, again, it's one of those little things. It doesn't take a lot of time. The kits are relatively inexpensive. The burr bit and the pin gauge, they're reusable. You can use them over and over and over again. And basically, again, what you're doing here is you're removing a potential source of friction from your rear drivetrain. And again, with these small motors, anything that you can do to ensure that you don't introduce that friction, or you can eliminate that friction, minimize it, it just helps ensure that the motor is working as efficiently as possible, and that the rear wheel RPMs are as high as possible, that you're not losing any RPMs because of unwanted friction, because your bushings are binding up on the axle just a little bit. So again, if you can either source these components yourself, or if you'd like to buy a prepackaged kit, you can visit my website, www.slotcar.com. There's also a how-to article out on Slot Car Illustrated that provides a brief write-up on this procedure with some pictures. And if you have any questions, you can. My contact information is on the website. So thank you very much, and I hope this helps you with your car tuning.